All right, welcome everyone. Good to see you here. Thanks for joining us on this Friday morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker today. Caroline Hickman is a psychotherapist and lecturer at the University of Bath, researching children and young people's emotional responses to climate change in the UK and around the world. For 10 years, she has been examining eco-anxiety and distress, eco-empathy, trauma, moral injury, and the impact of climate anxiety on family relationships. She was a co-lead researcher and author on a 2021 quantitative global study into children and young people's emotions and thoughts about climate change, which was published in the Lancet Planetary Health Journal, which you may have heard conversations around that last year. I won't say any more. I'll pass it over to Caroline, who I'm sure will tell us about that and all sorts of other things throughout the session. But just to say, I think Caroline will speak for the first half, and then we'll have lots of time for questions and conversation in the second half. So if you have questions as you're going along, feel free to type them in the chat. I think we'll use the chat today rather than going separately to Slido, because it will be a little bit more of an informal kind of conversation rather than a Q&A. But without any more from me, over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Liam. There's another Hickman here, Leanne. I think this is the first time in years of doing these talks that there's another Hickman in the house. Hello. We're related. We're going to have to be related somehow, right?
Well, I married one for sure. Definitely from Northern England.
Yeah?
Yes. So we'll have to cater on that after.
It's a very unusual name. So it's from only one geographical region in the UK, which is the Northwest Midlands. So anyway, sorry, we're having an overexcited family reunion here. Yes. It's lovely to meet you all, and I'm really pleased to be here. As Liam said, feel free to stick comments, stick questions, observations in the chat as we go through. If we were all in a room together, I'd be saying, I really like interruption, but it's a bit more awkward this way, isn't it? But, I've got a solid sort of presentation for you, which I want to get through. But please, if you're kind of wanting to interrupt me during that, just unmute and shout, because I'd rather we stopped and talked relevant to what I was saying than wait until all the end. So let's see how that goes, but we're not a huge number, so I think we can probably manage that. All right, so thank you for the introduction. And there is also, I ought to mention, although he's out of sight at the moment, a 5.5-month-old puppy in the room who has been fed, been walked, but if you hear squeaky things in the background, it's Wilfred. He's new to this. He's learning to leave me alone when I'm sat here, but we'll see. So thank you for the introduction. I very much want to present a kind of mixture of the clinical perspective around climate change, climate psychology, eco-anxiety, but interspersed and linked with the academic research side of things. Because I work as a psychotherapist, I have a private practice, I work with a lot of children, young people, but also just as many adults in my psychotherapy practice. Most of my research has been with children, young people. But when I say young people, I'm talking, my research is with the age range between the age of 4 and 5 and 30. And when I talk about young people, I'm talking late 20s to 30, because demographically, there is a commonality often, even with younger children, about emotional responses, and certainly about the kind of culpability and responsibility in terms of climate change and looking at climate change. So that I would certainly be talking about people in their mid to late 20s as young people. Wilfred is on the move. I'm just going to ignore him. And I want to start with a reading, and I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint in a minute, but I just want to start with a reading. We live in perilous times. and the peril is of our own making. So that's the other thing I ought to mention. The first part of this talk is not nice. It's not pretty. It's not easy. It's uncomfortable. It's emotionally uncomfortable. And it has to be. So I want to acknowledge that with you. And I promise that I will not leave you in that at the very end. And there will be space at the end to talk and kind of regroup emotionally and bring ourselves back together a little bit. But I take us down first. I'm a depth psychologist, depth psychotherapist, and we're not going to just talk about what is one of the worst things that humanity is facing and has ever faced in a nice way to begin with. So we live in perilous times, and the peril is of our own making, and many of us probably deserve it. But the children and the native peoples of this world, and most important, all the other species sashaying around in this great dance of life, don't deserve the peril we've created. The ecologist Raymond Dasman says that World War III has already started, and it's the war of industrial humans against the earth. He's correct. All of us are warriors on one side or another in this war. There are no sidelines. There are no civilians. Ours is the last generation that will have the choice of wilderness, clean air, abundant wildlife, and expansive forests. The crisis is that severe. What's important is you do something now. So I used to be able, years ago, to get away with reading that at the start of talks and then say, what year was that written? Or I can't really get away with it quite so well nowadays, but stick your answer in the chat. What year was this written? Let's see what you think. The background noise is Wilfred trying to bury a dog biscuit in a sofa. A little bit when nature joins in. So we're getting some interesting answers here. Yeah, you see, you're going to be too wised up. A few years ago, I could get away with reading that and say, when was that? And people would say, oh, that's Greta Thunberg. Oh, that was last week or last month or last year. Because that's what it sounds like, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. It's resonant. It sounds like the youth climate strikers. It sounds contemporary. This was written in 1970 and published. This was published in 1991, which is before quite a few of you were even born. Right. So I'm sorry. So where we're going first is this is what we knew. We knew this. We've known this for decades. We've known this since before the 1960s. So if we know this, and we knew this, why are we in the position we're in today? So this is what psychology is going to be asking us. This is where psychology can help us try and understand that and explain that. And I'm not suggesting it can fully explain it, but it can help. And it helps in two particular ways. And that is, number one, to take care of ourselves as we face the reality of what's going on in the world. So this is about looking after ourselves, dealing with the psychological trauma, the mental health aspects, the here and now, and into the future. Yeah, that's one bit. But the other bit is asking that difficult question, how come? How come we're here? How come we knew this, right? And didn't act? And yes, you can have an economic, political, technological argument about that. Of course you can. But that's not enough. Because we've also had the technology to deal with climate change for decades and not used it. So you see what I mean? We've got a problem here when we come to understand humanity and humanity's way of engaging with this question. So, you know, the climate crisis is like nothing else that humanity has ever faced, ever. So we don't actually have a psychological blueprint. We actually don't, our mental, cognitive, psychological capacity is not up to the problem that we've got. We've never faced anything like this. It's hard to imagine this. Timothy Morton, the philosopher, calls this a hyperobject, by which he means it's too big to imagine, it's too big to see, it's too big to engage with, it's too big to relate to. So you kind of like deal with plastics. You think, okay, I've got plastic in my sights and I can think about plastic. And then somebody says, yeah, but what about ocean acidification? You go, okay, right. So we'll worry about that. And then somebody says, yeah, but what about air pollution? You're like, okay, right. And then what about the Pacific heat dome? And what about rising sea levels? Do you see what I mean? It's so systemic and so global and so huge. It's really hard to hold in mind the whole of it. It's hard to see it, hard to think about it. So of course it's hard to know how to feel about it. Am I making sense? Am I making sense? Yeah. This is one of the reasons why it's so difficult, because we've never faced anything like this. So we actually don't know actually how to do it. Even though I've been studying this for 10 years, I've got some answers, but not complete answers. And one of the common ways that people make themselves feel better about this is by saying, well, yeah, but humanity is innovative and humanity has faced other disasters and is currently facing other disasters like the invasion of Ukraine and world wars and the Cuban Missiles crisis. And, you know, we are facing global threats regularly and we survive and we find a way. Yeah, you'd be right. But we've got a problem here. I did say I was going to take you down first, right? So is everyone with me? Everyone okay with this? You ready to get down there? Problem is, one of the ways that humanity contains itself and finds ways through these threats and these crises, world wars, terrible things, is by imagining itself on the other side. We reassure ourselves by saying, when we get beyond this, when we get on the other side of this, and you hear this with COVID, when we beat COVID, when we get beyond COVID, yeah? One of the ways people keep themselves psychologically safe through a world war is by when we can go back home, when we can return, when we can rebuild. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, do you see what I mean? That's how we keep ourselves from collapsing into unbearable despair. That's how we keep hope alive. Can you see where I'm going with this? We can't say this about the climate crisis because it's already too late. Even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, it's too late for the Maldives, it's too late for Bangladesh, it's too late for India, it's too late for all the low-lying Pacific nations. There's so much carbon in the atmosphere, sea levels will continue to rise. It's too late. We cannot stop the climate emergency. It's too late for the billions of animals that have died. Is that making sense? Yeah, I'm sorry. This is shit, right? We cannot stop it. So if we comfort ourselves by saying we can prevent climate change, we can fight climate change, it's delusional. It's too late. And I'm not saying there aren't things we can do. There's a lot we can do. It's too late to stop it. We have to wake up to the fact we're in the middle of the story. It's only by waking up to the fact we're in the middle of the story that we can change the ending of the story. It's not too late to change the ending of the story. Karishma has said the ship has sailed and there won't be another to take us to our destination. No, not quite. I'm not doom. You might be sitting there thinking she's all doom and gloom nihilism. No, I'm not. I actually have a curious kind of optimism. But I'm a realist. I am determinedly realistic. So I don't think we can tell ourselves a fairy story to comfort ourselves that we can change everything and make everything okay. because that's delusional. And that stops us from dealing with the reality of what we've got to do. If we face reality, we have a chance. I have couples come into therapy all the time saying, our marriage is a mess, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad. Well, but it's a mess. They're on the brink of divorce and they're telling me it's not that bad and paying me quite a lot of money at the same time. It's like, well, which one is it? Right? You know what it's like to be a human being who knows what they need to do to make the changes they need to make. How long do we put these things off for? How many, there's probably not a single person here who's living their life they think they should be living in the way they should be living it, because we just don't do it, right? Moving from awareness to acceptance. Yes, kind of. Yeah, that's more like it. You're absolutely right. It's a different kind of acceptance. It's a particular kind of acceptance. I'm talking about a non-defended radical acceptance. It's the undefendedness of it, facing reality, standing in that reality. This is what's behind speakers like Greta Thunberg, who says, I want you to panic. I want you to feel this. She's right. We have to feel the urgency if we're going to act with purpose. And if our action will have potency and be effective. And all of the, oh, it's not that bad. If it was that bad, the government would do something. If it was that bad, somebody would have done something about it. That one's one of my favorites, as is the government will save us, technology will save us, carbon capture will save us. These are fairy stories. My absolute favorite is a group that believes that at the point of annihilation, aliens will descend to the earth in spacecraft and lift us out. Right, that's one of my favorites, because that is no different to thinking the government will save us. Right, it's the same thing. Right, so it's this expectation that this powerful other out there will rescue us. Are you with me? Yeah, same thing. Not going to happen. I think the aliens are infinitely more likely than the government. So it's, I can say this, I live in Wiltshire in the UK. Wiltshire in the UK is the single county with the largest number of UFO sightings in the UK, and crop circles. And we even have a crop circle museum. So this is the hot spot for UFO sightings in the UK. So I'm allowed to say these things. See what I'm saying? You with me? You following me? Who hates me right now? I'm sure some of you hate me right now. I'm sure some of you would love me to shut up right now. Yeah, it's horrible, right? It's horrible stuff, but it's real, huh? Yeah. So I've been talking with children and young people for years, and, you know, they say to me things like, is there anyone from the Maldives here, by the way? Anyone from Maldives? Jennifer, it explains the way you've been feeling the past couple of weeks. Pretty devastated, I'm guessing then. Jeanette, oh, yeah, you're worried that you're going to have to leave the meeting before we get to the good bit. This is the good bit. No, I'm joking. But paradoxically, it is by being able to tolerate being in the reality of this that there is a kind of comfort. So the recording will be available, yeah. But I'm going to show you. People talk to me a lot about how do you build resilience, and I think it's sweet when people ask about resilience, because especially like, you know, teenagers and really young people, because I say, well, you fail, you mess up your life, you fail, you get things wrong, and then you get up and you try again, and then you fail again. And then you realize that it's all gone pear-shaped and gone off a cliff, and you get back up and then you try again and then you fail again. This is how we build resilience. So think of this as a emotional resilience building, which is we need to get to this depth in order to be able to make the journey and develop sustainable activism. This is about sustainable activism, not the kind of activism or beliefs where you get hopeful and then crash and burn, and then hopeful and then depressed, and then hopeful and depressed. That leads to burnout. Okay. Child in the Maldives said to me, he said, well, he said, we saw online that people in Iceland had a funeral for a glacier. He said, but we're going to be underwater soon. Who's going to have a funeral for us, for our whole country? Even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, which we're not going to do, sea levels will continue to rise. The Maldives will go underwater, as will all of the Pacific Islands. Do you see what I mean? And the children and young people there know this. Another one in the Maldives said to me, he said, climate change is like Thanos in the Avengers Endgame, whose ideology is to kill off half the life in the universe so the other half can thrive. He said, but we're the half being killed off. So I think it's not okay that half the population of the world is sacrificing the other half. It's just not okay. That's the stuff we've got to face. So I will not leave you there, I promise. I promise I won't leave you there. So this is like a journey, if you like, from eco-anxiety to eco-empathy to eco-aliveness. Acceptance. Acceptance risks being a bit passive. But it doesn't have to be, does it? But it's a radical acceptance. It's a radical hope. And radical hope says, well, we might be going off a cliff, but we're going to go down fighting. We're going to do everything we could possibly do. So I don't want to offend anybody. COVID is no joke. I had COVID 3 times now. I'm one of the lucky ones. And because I had it twice before we really knew what it was. COVID's no joke. But in the scale of things, it's nothing compared to the global threat of climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And we probably should put COVID into the biodiversity crisis wave anyway. So it's no joke. But this is what we're facing. We're facing incremental threats. It's a very unique time to be alive. And humor, mature defenses. So you're thinking, how do we cope with this? Well, humor is a mature defense. It can help. Might be, slightly shadowy humor, but it's reality. She's saying, can you give me a hand moving these from the fiction to the non-fiction section? It's The Hunger Games, The Road, Planet of the Apes, 1984. Hollywood has known and has predicted and created films about what we're moving into for a very long time, including, that most recent film, Don't Look Up. So this is very much predicted and unknown. Young woman recently in the US, I have as many clients around the world as I do in the UK because I just work entirely online. And this is a young woman in the US. She said to me a few weeks ago, she said, I wish I was mad. She has very strong climate anxiety. It really makes daily life difficult for her. And she said, I wish I was mad. She said, because if I was mad, then my fears about climate change would be madness and climate change wouldn't be happening. And it would be easier to deal with the fact that I'm mad than to deal with climate change. And it's all on a spectrum. I'm going to talk about this on a spectrum. There's mild anxiety and distress about climate, and there's severe and critical distress about it. And most of us move up and down at different times. She's pretty much at the severe end most of the time. But through therapy, we're getting there. She's learning to navigate that. And that's what we're talking about. Being able to navigate the complexity of this without either shutting down, going numb, feeling nothing, or going into denial, or being overwhelmed and flooded and, you know, unable to function. Gus Speth used to be the US advisor on climate change pre-Obama. He said, I used to think top environmental problems are biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And with 30 years good science, we can deal with that. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And scientists don't know how to do that. Yeah, I think increasingly scientists are signing up to the fact that they don't know how to do it and are working alongside or working more holistically or working more systemically with communities, with social policy analysts, with psychologists, because that's what we need. And with activists, of course. So I've kind of said this to a degree. Why psychology? What is psychology going to bring to the table? So it's bringing two things to the table. One, how to cope with this, how this feels. But the other one is to look at why we're in this situation that we're in and how to tackle that and stop it getting worse. So there's a kind of use of psychological understanding to understand how we've got in this mess. Because if we can figure out how we got in this mess, it'll help us find different pathways through it and beyond it. So of course we need rational, technical, political, economic, scientific solutions. Of course we do. But we're delusional if we think that's enough on its own. For the reasons I've said, we've had the solutions for years, never acted on them. You know, so the problem is psychologically what we've got to deal with is what's underneath this rational layer. Humans are not rational creatures. You know, there would be no war if we were rational creatures. We've got to look at what's under the surface of this, what's behind the defenses, what's in the denial, because humans defend against things that are unbearable or too big for us to comprehend. And we're not just talking about simple psychological change here, we're talking about transformational change. This is almost like an evolutionary leap that we need to make spiritually, culturally, politically, collectively, socially, emotionally. It's fairly challenging. And this is the psychological model that I'm using. So this is a psychoanalytic model where we have roughly 5% conscious functioning and roughly 95% unconscious functioning. And in between these two, there's the subconscious, and we push into the unconscious anything that we're ashamed of, that's unbearable, that we wish to deny, and then it seeps back up into conscious awareness, and then we try and push it back down, and it seeps back up, often when our defenses are down in our dreams or when we're least expecting it. This is the model I'm using. If you're familiar with the Pixar film Inside Out, it shows brilliantly the scale of the unconscious and just how big it is. And this is partly what holds the key to understanding why we've got in this mess in the first place. Because rationally, as humans, we say we're going to do the right thing. However, we frequently act the opposite way and then rationalize it. Paul Hoggett was one of the founders of a group called the Climate Psychology Alliance. It's UK based, although there's an American group, and in fact, it's global now. There's an open access website, loads of resources, go and help yourself. He said, we're living in this time when a tragedy which is without precedent is unfolding in front of our eyes. We're witnessing catastrophic rates of species extinction, biodiversity loss, soil and ocean exhaustion, runaway climate change. So this is crucial psychologically, is that we are living in something as it happens. Humans prefer to deal with the history, look back, or the future, look forwards. Trying to understand the here and now as we're living in it is really difficult for us because it's disconcerting, it's confusing. We don't trust our eyes, we don't trust reality, we don't trust what we see and feel. So this witnessing, it's unbearable. It's without precedent. and it's unfolding. So it's constantly changing. The whole situation will not keep still long enough for us to go, right, now I know where I'm, you know, and then it's changed again. It's too rapid for us. So, you know, this is what we're talking about. These are cumulative impacts of climate change, with record heat, waves, wildfires, sea level rise, ice melting, flooding. And this is so much emphasis has been placed on physical health harm. Increasingly, people are recognizing the psychological impact, the mental health impact. The latest IPCC report that came out in February was the very first to talk about the psychological impact in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, depression, and anxiety. So there are two stresses here. One is the short term, which is shock to extreme weather events, and then maybe a panic attack following extreme heat. But then there's also long-term impacts psychologically, resource disruption, unable to go to school, loss of hope for the future. And this psychological distress is both short-term and long-term. So we have climate anxiety, trauma, vicarious trauma, by hearing stories of other people's suffering. We have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complicated grief. It's really hard to feel a clean, straightforward grief around this because we've caused this. So we are culpable. And that culpability that can get in the way with guilt and shame. So it's hard to feel straightforward grief around this because we've done it and we're still doing it. So psychologically, it's incredibly complicated. This is also important to put this in the frame of the relationship with the other, the animals, the plants. This is not just a human crisis. And particularly for a lot of children and young people, it's this harm being done to the innocent animals, which is powerfully relatable. I'm not generalizing too much. A lot of adults are equally motivated by this. But it's that innocence of the animal that can be felt as unbearable. And it is a collective, it is an interdependency. And I always mention this guy, this is the bramble key melomete, and he's the first mammal to go extinct because of human-caused climate change. This is in 2018. And he's extinct because he lived here on this low-lying island off the coast of Australia, which is now inundated with salt water. Now, in terms of biodiversity, we could live without him. We can manage without him. Of course we can. Not fair on him and his family, but we can manage without him. But let's have a think about how humanity deals with things. Do we extrapolate? Do we start to say, oh, well, we can manage without giraffes. Oh, we can manage without polar bears. Oh, dolphins, who needs them? And then what about, we can manage without Nigeria. No, we can manage without Bangladesh. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think we should grieve him and pay attention to where we go with those trajectories, with these arguments. There is already migration problems all over the world. There is already millions of climate migrants, and there will be more. And they need to go somewhere. And the rich industrial Western capitalist nations that have caused this problem have a duty of care. A lot of money was promised to countries to deal with climate change, which has not yet been paid, and it needs to be. And then we need to budge up. We're going to have to make room for people. And, you know, we're already struggling with migration. Countries are already putting up walls. It's not going to get easier. So we need to mature psychologically and spiritually and morally if we're going to deal with this. Oops. So what do we mean by climate anxiety? Well, it's two things. It's the anxiety and distress that we feel in relation to environmental destruction and degradation. And this makes perfect sense. It is an emotionally healthy response. Increasingly, I say to young people, look, you're feeling anxiety, you're feeling distress in relation to the environment, in relation to climate, in relation to the animals. But you're only feeling this because you care. You don't feel climate anxiety if you don't care. So you should feel proud of feeling this anxiety. You should feel proud that you care. This is an emotionally healthy response. Shows you have a moral conscience. This is not something to be ashamed of or to be labeled or pathologized. This is not mental illness. This is a sign of moral integrity and emotional mental health. And there's another side to it, which is it's not just about the environmental problems. It's because the people with the power to act are failing to act. Governments, big business, are failing to take the action that they need to take, and they have the power to take. So it's both of those things. It's the distress about the environment, plus it's the distress of abandonment and betrayal by the very people who we either elect to take care of our countries, governments, or other adults that, we want grown-ups to make wise decisions on behalf of the rest of us, don't we? And they're not doing. And that betrayal, that is a painful betrayal relationally. It's very close to my background prior to psychotherapy 25 odd years ago, and I still teach social work. So I was a social worker for decades. I still teach at the University of Bath social work. And for me, I worked with trauma and children and young people following trauma and adults recovering from trauma for years, still do. And for me, dealing with climate trauma is very similar to dealing with the trauma that children and young people feel when they are traumatized and abused within their birth family. Because it's the people who are meant to be looking after you and protecting you who are the people who are hurting you. And often when you're emotionally abused or physically abused or sexually abused within a birth family, the people who are hurting you are also at the same time telling you that they love you. And it's that psychological twist and damage that sets up an enormous pain and confusion in people. And it's that when our governments say, yes, we're taking action on climate change, whilst doing the opposite. During the recent COP in Glasgow at the end of last year, the men inside the buildings in suits, primarily, of course, white men in suits, were congratulating themselves at their achievement. And I am not dismissing what they achieved. They achieved some things. So they were happy. On the streets outside in Glasgow, the indigenous populations, the communities, the young people, the children were crying because they knew that the decision that had been made would fail to keep under 1.5 degrees of warming, which was effectively a death sentence for these countries that I've been mentioning. So that is the betrayal. And this is the global injustice side of these things, but it's a psychological injustice as well. It's a moral injury. So if it's a sign of mental health to be feeling anxious, then you could also argue, well, does that mean you're mentally unhealthy if you're not anxious, not depressed, not worried? Well, yeah, I would say so. I'd say, what are you doing with your feelings? How are you coping with this? What levels of denial and delusion are you having to use to not look and face the reality of what we're living in? Yeah.
Carolyn,
Scary.
can I jump in here just because
Yeah,
you feel free?
Yeah.
I guess I want to speak to the part of me that like doesn't want to look and just feels numb. I imagine like for me, when the IPCC report came out in 2018 and 2019, that was like a big wake up call. And I started working in this space, and then COVID happened and I really just like shut down. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on addressing this big mix of like shame, guilt, that makes me just want it to like to know that like I cannot deal with the problem, and I, with all my privilege, will be to some extent, although my family's also very affected, but yeah, like I can ignore it to some extent. And sometimes I just don't feel emotional about it. I feel, like it's just like another story. Like and there's so many, and it will get worse. It's like, how do I, yeah, I feel like if I am emotionally impacted, then I'm just like not functioning. Like I'm supposed to go on a date after this workshop. I'm like, what do I tell this person? Like, I'm just gonna be like, like, yeah.
Well, I promise we'll send you on your date feeling good. No, I mean it, because I feel okay, and I know all this stuff, and I work with this stuff every day. Okay, it's about. I was at a webinar in the Philippines at the end of last year, and I'm going to show you some figures for the Philippines in a minute. And after every slide, I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my God, I'm so sorry." But we started with a brilliant question, which is it okay to not be okay because of the climate emergency? It's a brilliant question. It's exactly where we need to be standing, which is it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay. You can be okay with not being okay. I know that sounds a bit weird. You're not feeling, you're not going numb. What's happening psychologically is you're feeling too much. So numbness is not feeling. Numbness is feeling too much, feeling overwhelmed, and then closing down in order to just cope, right? So it's not that you're not feeling at all. And the more extreme end of that is a kind of disconnection, a kind of out of body experience. Really, it's about being able to learn to stand in the feelings, but not be overwhelmed by them, to make friends with your feelings. I know that sounds a bit cliched, and then turn your feelings into a form of action, because they are your greatest weapon. And this is a war, as far as I'm concerned. So this is about using emotion to communicate about this in emotionally intelligent, resilient ways to get through to people, as well as to get through to yourself, and to learn to navigate this stuff. So this is about developing emotional resilience, learning to live in a world that is not easy to live in, but is interesting. And there is a curious comfort in that. That can be reparative. It can be healing, because once you're in the reality, well, I don't want to be anywhere else. I'll face this reality and keep the guilt and the grief and the shame and the anger and the frustration and all of those things around me, but not be overwhelmed by them. But then I use them to help me empathize with the people in, I don't want this to sound patronizing, but my friends in Nigeria, with the people in the Maldives, in Bangladesh, I turn my feelings to good use. I want to use them to help me understand, use them to help me take action, use them to help me communicate. So they're useful to me. So really it's about getting those feelings to work for you. Does that make sense? Does it make any sense?
Yeah, it does. It's just like,
Not easy. Are you okay?
I mean, no, but it's okay.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. Yeah. Yeah. Come back to what I said a minute ago. You should feel proud for caring. So we just need to support you to care. And you need to know you're not on your own.
Yeah, I could say I'm right there with you, Kay.
Yeah. And that sense of connection and belonging and community that you can get from knowing that you're not on your own. Means something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I'm trying not to suppress myself so much, so I appreciate feeling like I can actually cry here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm glad you feel that too. It's a both and. Psychologically, we need both and approaches to this. We need to feel the distress and navigate a way through it, rather than go to a kind of either or way of thinking, either I'll be distressed or not. That splitting apart between the feeling and not feeling is partly what causes the difficulty for us psychologically. It's about not feeling okay, and then not being self-critical or dismissive, and knowing that it's okay to not feel okay, because it means that you're being congruent, you're being caring. It's the price we pay for being vulnerable, sensitive, thoughtful, caring human beings. All of these feelings are part of climate anxiety, all of them. So anxiety is often the first thing we feel. It's the gateway. But all of these follow grief, solastalgia, which is love of place, hope and hopelessness, anger, blame, frustration, guilt and shame, sadness and grief, fantasies of rescue, just allow them. Apocalyptic fantasies, yep, let them be there, but I call them fantasies because we psychologically bounce between imagining rescue and then imagining the worst. Ironically, those are both, neither of those are true. Number one, they're not necessarily true. It's not all over, but there is not some magical rescue either. Both of those are attempts to get away from uncertainty and vulnerability, which is in the middle. So you have the safe place to be through all this is in that vulnerability and uncertainty, and hold the tension around that uncertainty and not know. We can't be sure. There are a few things we do know. There are many things we don't know. The only way psychologically to be safe is tolerate the uncertainty. And if you feel nihilistic or despairing or hopeless, allow it. But don't get trapped in it. Don't get stuck in it. Visit, but don't live there. It's okay to visit. I do regularly. I go and sit with my back against a tree until it passes, which it does, because I just think, okay, my nihilism's come to visit for an hour. Okay. This is about having the balance with internal activism and external activism. Internal activism is being able to learning how to navigate this emotional range, which is not easy, but it is what makes it okay. A friend of mine's an ecologist and she laughs at me because I call this having an emotional biodiversity, and she says it's not what biodiversity really means, but I'll use it anyway. So we need to feel all of this, but not all on the same day. So moving between these feelings is healthy, psychologically healthy. What you need is movement between them. This is that last report in February. Antonio Guterres said delay is death. This is the first report to talk about mental health last month. And I love Antonio Guterres. He really just says it straight. He says the facts are undeniable. Abdication of leadership is criminal. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson of our only home. He's very clear. where the culpability lies. The UNICEF report 2021 talks about the numbers of children at high risk as a result. 1 billion children, increased risk factors for mental illness. And this is because of the chronic stress in childhood. So what can we do about this? What we can do is what I'm trying to talk about here, which is build emotional resilience. Emotional resilience around this is preventative in terms of psychological and mental health problems. Being able to feel the distress and recover from it, being able to visit but not live there. I go to all those places quite regularly, but I don't stay there. So that capacity, stretch your heart, stretch your psyche, stretch emotionally your range so that you can allow all of those feelings. The Western medical model of mental health is unhelpful here because it says, oh, anxiety is a problem, depression is a problem, we should get rid of those feelings, you shouldn't feel those things. Yeah, of course we should feel those things because we've got an external reality which provokes anxiety and provokes depression. So it's healthy to feel that in response to it. That's how we measure mental health, by looking at our capacity to respond to that external reality. External reality is horrible, but it's not all horrible. There is also beauty in the world, and there is compassion, and there is culture, and there is kindness, and there is community. And those are all the reparative things. We need to keep both, not just collapse into it's all terrible. We need to have this is terrible and this is beautiful, and then keep both alive. So this is the climate anxiety scale that I was talking about a minute ago. From the mild, where we can be reassured. If you've got mild anxiety, you can be reassured. And there's a focus on hope and optimism. And then as we kind of learn more and it gets worse, we doubt other people's care about us. And then we lose our defenses against anxiety. And then sleep can be affected, and the worst end. I've been working as a psychotherapist with young people who are suicidal, who are self-harming, who just don't know how to cope with this at all. Very few people are at that severe end, thankfully. The good news is I'm finding that therapeutic support works to help people move out of that critical severe end to a way of navigating this that makes it acceptable, makes it bearable. The dreams, I think, are the worst because that's when they get in under the covers when we're asleep, when our defenses are down. People are having dreams and nightmares now about climate change, more and more and more. And I want that to be taken seriously. So I'm on a bit of a mission to get mental health services to understand this and to not tell people that they're crazy. I spend a lot of time saying to people, you're not crazy, there's nothing wrong with you. And yes, we need to support you with this so that you can learn to cope with these feelings. But you're not crazy, you're the healthy ones. A child in the Maldives said to me, he said, my friends are dying. He said, my friends, the fish, are dying. Numbers, large numbers. I'm going to skip a few because I want to get to, oh, actually, that's interesting for you. This was a British Association Counselling Psychotherapy survey. The thing I would just want to look at very quickly here is the age difference, because this is interesting. Higher numbers in the 16 to 24 and the 25 to 34 are very worried about climate change. And then it drops midlife in the 45 to 54-year-old age group, and then it starts to go back up again after 65. I don't know why, because they didn't interview people. This is just numbers research. I wonder if it's because in the middle of your lives, you're juggling jobs, families, care for children, poverty, I don't know, racism, homophobia, all the whole mix of things that we all struggle with. Care for older parents, care for children at the same time. Could be a real mix, but it often seems to drop. But it's higher at the beginning and higher at the end of life. But I can't tell you more than that. It is now being recognized. This is good news. It's being recognized as an adverse childhood experience, which is equivalent. We don't want eco-anxiety to be labeled as a mental illness. That would be pathologizing and locating the problem in the individual when it's actually a collective, social, political, global problem. So we don't want that, but we do need to acknowledge people's suffering and find a way to support them. So I think one of the ways this can be done is the fact that it's now being recognized as what's called an adverse childhood experience, which is similar to war, facing war, which has long-term psychological threats. But it's not guaranteed. If you're given support, psychological support, you see, in childhood, if you're provided with psychological support around these things, then actually you can turn this around and develop resilience, and it can give you a positive mental health experience, not negative. Many years ago, decades ago, I worked with young people who were diagnosed as HIV positive. And this was in the years when the drugs were no use. So you're basically given a year to live. And after a year of therapy with these young people, a number of them were able to say, I'm not sorry I got this diagnosis. Because by facing the reality of it and being supported therapeutically, they turned their lives around. They learned to love. They left jobs they hated. They found things that gave their life meaning. And they lived their lives fully in that year in a way they hadn't done before. They did similar research a couple of years after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York on the Twin Towers. Obviously not straight after the trauma, of course not. 2 years later, researchers went and talked to people who'd been caught up in the terrorist attacks and survived, obviously. And they said, does anything good come out of this for you? And a significant number of people said yes. Again, they'd turned their lives around. They'd got closer to the people they loved. They'd found meaning in their life that had been missing for them before. And they were able to attribute that positive change directly to having gone through that trauma and got hold of that trauma and said, no, I'm going to make something out of this. So that's the good news. By facing the reality emotionally and facing it now, and taking that psychological resilient attitude, you can actually be at a higher level of functioning psychologically than when you went in. So you can make good out of this.
Before you go on, Caroline, there's a question in the chat about clarifying that adverse childhood experience. Is it specific to an actual climate-related event, or can it also come from the threat of, or the thought of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. No, it doesn't have to be, it does not have to be direct experience. It can be indirect experience. So it can be reading about it in the news. It can be watching it on television. It can be anticipating wildfire season in Portugal. It can be living in fear of this happening. So it can be direct experience, but it can also be indirect. And that's why it's so widespread. So it is affecting people globally, because what it comes with is that sense of helplessness and powerlessness, which we feel when we think about what could happen. Yeah. It kind of leads people to sort of live in this kind of low-grade, constant state of fear and anxiety. I want to do the quant research, partly because there is a positive message at the end of it, because I have promised you some good news, and we're running short on time. So give me 10 more minutes and then we'll have some time to talk. This is the quant research that myself and a group of researchers did last year with 10,000. This was the biggest global study. And our basic findings were that, I'll go through some of the statistics with you in a minute, that this has a long-term impact on mental health and linked to government failure to act, basically. This is 10,000 children and young people and the paper is publicly available. Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, UK, US. We had to choose those countries. We had to turn this research around very quickly. This was publicly funded, not publicly funded, crowd-funded research through Avaz. We did this research in under 6 months. It would normally probably have taken about 3 years. None of the researchers got paid for this. We did this as, voluntary work. And Avaz crowd-funded to pay for it. So 8 out of 10 children around the world worry that climate change is threatening people and the planet, and 45% reported negative impact on daily functioning. This was low in the UK, 28%. If I show you this, it makes it clearer. So we have similarly high levels of emotional impact around the world. Where you see a big difference is impact on daily functioning. India, 74%, Philippines, 74%, Brazil, 50%, Nigeria, 66%, because these countries are facing the immediacy of the impact. UK, only 28%, US, 26%, Finland, 31%, Australia, 32%. Because at the moment in these countries, the impact of climate change is not affecting your daily life as much. Now, it will do if you are psychologically, emotionally, politically aware. It'll affect you psychologically, but you're not having to leave your house because it's being flooded every 5 minutes. Emotionally, worldwide, 67% of young people said it made them sad and afraid. The emotional impact is very similar no matter which country you're in. There are some differences, but I'm not going to go into those. I'm just going to show you some. It's also about cognitive impact, 55% worldwide, 53% in the UK. You see the similarity here. Think they won't have access to the same opportunities parents had. Here's the big difference. It's about security. 52% worldwide, only 39% UK think family security will be threatened. That's the difference. Now it gets similar again. 83% worldwide, 80% UK, 92% Philippines think people have failed to take care of the planet. Like I said, I presented this in the Philippines in December. I apologized after every slide. 3/4 or more think the future is frightening. 75% worldwide, 73% UK. You see the similarity. I think this is really important. The children and young people in countries that are not facing the immediacy of the impact, like the UK and the US and Finland, share the thoughts, share the emotional, the similarity there cognitively and emotionally with the Nigeria, India, Philippines, of course, it's much higher. Over half think humanity is doomed, 56% worldwide, 51% UK. Lower in Nigeria, 73% Philippines. That's pretty bad. This is worse. This we could change this afternoon. 48% of children in the UK and worldwide said they were dismissed or ignored by other people when they tried to talk about climate change. That's not okay. We need to talk about climate change, right? That's the only thing that can help us feel better. This was a bit higher in the Philippines, 51%, higher in Nigeria, 66%. Politically, it's dangerous in Nigeria to talk about climate change. Climate activists in Nigeria can be kidnapped and murdered. And then we looked at, we've got these scales for all different countries, but I've just given you the UK ones. 65% thought the government were failing young people. Only 31% thought that the government was protecting children. Only 28% thought governments can be trusted. There's a massive sense of betrayal here. Anguish, betrayal, abandonment from young people worldwide. And there is hope. I did promise you some hope. Young people can feel reassured, protected, valued, listened to, if we listen to them. This is the group of researchers that did this work from America, Finland, the UK, mixture of psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and an ecologist. So here's the hope. I started getting emails from children all over the world last year, and like this one. I'm only a single private person studying in Germany, but I feel the urge to thank you and your colleagues for this research. What the study reveals makes me, for the first time ever, feel I am not alone with the future and climate anxiety I experience every day. I don't know what to do with this. I sent her lots of resources. But I consider this study as an incredibly important step for us young people around the world to emotionally connect and visually realize that no one of us is alone with this huge issue. I really hope the message of your study reaches politicians around the world, as well as socio-psychological professions, so they can react to the needs of us young people. I started getting emails from children and young people all over the world saying, thank you, I feel better. That's how I feel. I no longer feel crazy. I presented this research, these figures, to groups of adults and children. And the adults often look at me in horror and I think, oof, you're not going to ask me back. And then we ask in the Zoom chat, we ask the children, how do you feel? What do you think? And they start writing, this makes me feel better. I feel relief. I no longer feel crazy, because this is how they feel. So I'm linking this to climate justice and moral injury. And there is a really big court case at the moment in the European Court of Human Rights, where 6 children and young adults from Portugal are taking 33 European governments to court for failing to act on climate change. In Australia recently, there was an overturning of the case where the Environment Minister was told she didn't have a duty of care to protect young people when making decisions about fossil fuel extraction. It'll be challenged. This is what gives me hope. Client Earth and Shell. They are arguing that Shell's board of directors bear personal responsibility for not preparing to cut emissions fast enough. And Client Earth have bought shares in Shell. Client Earth are a group of lawyers, and they're trying to hold individual executives legally accountable for failure to tackle climate change. And they're taking them to court. So this is this connection with climate crisis as a human rights issue, which means we have to fight. And we fight through resilience and emotional intelligence. And this is the emotion that I was talking to you about. So why feel anxiety and depression and despair? This is why. Because this is the process of change, psychological, about maturational change. We go down into the bottom of this curve. We feel the anxiety, the fear, the guilt, the shame, the grief, the depression. We hit bottom. We feel terrible. And then through this acceptance, radical acceptance, often through grief, but connecting emotionally, we start to rebuild resilience emotionally, and we start to find radical hope, and we move forwards. And when we move forwards, you can see that you're at a higher level of functioning psychologically than when you went in. This is how you build emotional resilience. It's tough, it's hard, it hurts, but it's worth it. This is how we cope. Dealing with our uncertainty. Put your feelings into everything you do. This is an equation I borrowed from the Professional Association Diving Instructors, PADI, because I'm a diving instructor and I'm not a psychotherapist. So feel and think and breathe. Then you understand. Then you can act, and you can act in a sustainable way. Then you can have this radical hope. And these are your mature defenses. This is the stuff that helps. This acceptance, altruism, care, courage. We have to emotionally self-regulate. We have to forgive ourselves and others. We have to feel gratitude, humility. We need some humor. Mercy, mindfulness, moderation, respect, sublimation, short-term suppression. Go out on your date tonight and have a good time. And put your awful, painful feelings to one side and pick them up again tomorrow. It's fine. Put them to one side for a little while, then pick them up again tomorrow. Tolerance, self-talk. We need to be kind to ourselves. Yeah. And this is what heals us. Yeah, I've said all of this as we've gone. You can have these slides anyway. We have to face this denial. We have to grieve what we've done and lost. Then we are moving to eco-understanding, eco-empathy, eco-compassion, courage, eco-community, awareness, connection, belonging, meaning, eco-care, and eco-aliveness. I would rather be here than in the denial, even if it hurts, because it's real. Barack Obama said, you know, our children in the future are going to look back at us and say, did we all do all we could have done? That's all we have to do. Just do all we can do. Don't get caught in being perfectionists and thinking you've got to save the planet on your own. You haven't. You do your bit, and your bit is more than good enough, as long as we all do our bit. Because this is that anxiety, you know, this is about living fully in the world. It's about being a vulnerable human being, and there is nothing more beautiful than being a vulnerable human being hanging out with other vulnerable human beings. So I hope I managed to bring you back up a bit. Any questions? Just a tiny bit of time.
Thank you, Caroline. There's a question in the chat, and I know Karishma's been waiting as well. I just want to thank you for taking us on that journey, and especially towards the end, showing that the chart that you've showed before about having to go through the despair and the depression and finding a way to climb out the other side is really critical. So thank you for that. Let's hear from Karishma, and then I also want to get to Sticker's question in the chat, because I think that is a really good one as well. Sure. Go ahead, Karishma.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. It was amazing. So I have a couple of questions. Do you think resilience is a result of great pain that is looking to be acknowledged?
I'm not quite hearing exactly what you're asking. Ask it again.
Do you think resilience is a result of pain and requires to be acknowledged in some way? And my second question is that we're looking for a just and deep transition. And I feel when we talk about climate psychology and the amount of fear, despair, or insecurities that are there in humanity, and the solutions that we are building, if they are built on the foundation of these sort of fears, insecurity, etc., might be like good short term, but be like bring just that much amount of harm long term. Do you think that is also a cause of concern, like shallow transition versus deep transition?
Yeah.
So these two questions, please.
Yeah. I'll go with the second one first. The fear, despair, and security, I'm giving you a psychological answer, is wanting to be rescued by daddy. right? We want daddy. We want mummy and daddy. We collapse into infantile anxiety and insecurity and want to be rescued. And then we project onto governments, big business, that they will rescue us, or technology will rescue us. Something will rescue us. It's intensely personally disempowering. And what we have to do is not collapse into that insecurity and despair, and not misunderstand that insecurity and despair and insecurity. We have to not project outside ourselves to find the solution to that. We have to tolerate it and grow up. We have to mature and not project onto others. Every time we project onto others outside ourselves, we give them the power to either destroy us or save us. And in that moment, we feel like a child and we feel powerless. And that's what causes that unbearable emotion. So we have to tackle that by, you know, not giving them the power emotionally, and not giving them the power politically as well. And that's, you know, we can't do that on our own individually. And that's where it's a collective answer. But there's no way, you know, if we collapse into that fear and despair and insecurity, then we are abandoning ourselves, which means in turn we abandon others. And then we expect to be rescued. And it's a horrible, horrible cycle. Do you see what I mean? It's about not being able to tolerate. And I think this is now answering your first part of your question, which is about humanity not being able to tolerate and misunderstanding emotional pain. Emotional pain is just part of life, right? But the Western medical model has framed psychological pain and distress as something we should not feel, that we want to medicate. So you feel anxiety, you take anti-anxiety medication. You feel depression, take a pill, fix it. It's just completely wrong. It's absurd, right? It's insanity. Emotional pain is just emotional pain and distress. And it's meaningful. And if it's in relation to something that's real in the world, of course you should feel that way. What we don't want is for those feelings to become so overwhelming that you can't tolerate them and cope. So we need to be teaching people how to cope. So a lot of the work I do with groups of young people is I use a psychosocial education model to teach them about mental health, educate them about how to navigate these emotions, how to manage their anxiety, their depression, their fear. I teach them how to cope. Because we should be taught this stuff in schools. And, you know, our communities, our societies have become quite infantilized, where we just put the power in the hands of governments and business and expect them to look after us. And then if they don't, we have a tantrum and we throw our toys out of the pram and we get angry. You know, we're mature as a species and it's time to grow up, right? So we're not going to deal with this until we grow up or grow down, you see, into these emotions to get this resilience in order to mature. We need that wisdom. And a lot of that wisdom is held in Indigenous communities. I'm not romanticizing Indigenous communities, but they do not use the Western medical model. They understand about living in harmony with nature and about the interdependency. And they don't have this psychological model of infantilizing people. There's an expectation that if you mess up, you say sorry. What's her name? Jacinta Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, showed this beautifully a few months ago, where she went and said sorry to the Indigenous population for the children that were stolen in the 1960s and 1970s by the white colonial settlers. And she went and begged forgiveness from the Indigenous population. And she went and said sorry. It's online. Go and have a look at it. It's a fantastic moment where she stood in that guilt and that shame and that grief and said, sorry. And there were people crying around the room. And that was reparative, that it repaired that damage, right? And she had to be pretty grown up to do that and say sorry to do that. That reparative move is what will help us with that fear and that pain. If you've not watched her do that, have a look at it. It's an amazing moment online. We need to be able to do that. So I spend quite a lot of time standing in front of groups of children and young people saying, sorry, we've messed up. My generation's messed up. Generation before me messed up. It's only once we recognize how much we've messed up that we can start to do something. And when I say this to groups of young people, they go, no, 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 no. You're one of the good guys. No, 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 no. And they try to save me from my feelings. And I'm like, no, 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 no. You need to see you're grown up most of the time. Stand here, tolerate guilt, tolerate shame, tolerate anxiety, not collapse and go, I'm the worst person in the world, you know, or blame you, right? Go back to school, you know, don't be stupid. You need to see that somebody can model how to manage difficult feelings and say sorry and not be destroyed by them, but actually can be made more resilient and stronger by them emotionally. So I have little arguments with children about this all the time. And then they go, oh, okay. And then they cry and they say, thank you. And then that shows them how to do it. So, you know, have I learned this? By messing my life up repeatedly. Oh, there isn't enough time to tell you. By getting things wrong, by failing, getting back up, trying again. Yeah.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks for that, Caroline. I'd love to get to this question in the chat.
Wisdom for parents.
I think a lot of people feel this, and I know personally.
It's a huge question, right? I'm going to have to give you a quick answer.
Yeah, just for the benefit, if anyone can't see the chat, the question is about new parents or potential parents who are experiencing preemptive grief and regret about bringing up a child in such a hostile world, I suppose.
Yeah, I worked for a year with a group of parents a couple of years ago, and we processed these feelings. So the one thing I would say to parents, or imaginal parents, right? I think you're a parent if you're imagining having a child. And we all, you know, if you're thinking about having a child, you love children. So, you know, you can have imaginal children anyway. So I work with this group of parents, and I work with quite a lot of couples around this issue. And I'm just going to give you a short, concise answer, which is it's all about love. And having a child or not having a child is okay either way, so long as you love either the child that you choose to have or choose not to have. You have to love the child you don't have as well as the child you do have. And there is not a right and wrong. It's a dilemma. Okay? So you do not beat yourself up. You will not fix the climate crisis by not having a child. So if it's right for you to have a child as an act of love, then you do it. And you bring up that child with love and wisdom and compassion and kindness. And you honor the choice that you've made. And that is okay. That is good, right? We can't just stop having children. What's important is we do whatever we choose to do mindfully and with love and compassion. And we bring up our children with care. And we say, look, here's the world, you know? And I'm alongside you in this. And I chose to have you out of love. It's always, just always about love. And there isn't a right and wrong. So don't torture yourself either way, right? We need fabulous children in the world. Of course we do, you know? So, you know, but what I would definitely say is love your children, whether you give birth to them or whether you keep them alive in your heart and imagination and choose not to give birth to them. There is absolutely no right and wrong. So you cannot hurt yourself. Don't get stuck in, there is a right answer or a wrong answer. That's you splitting and hurting yourself. You have to hold the tension of those opposites and stay in your heart and stay in the middle of that. Okay.
Thank you, Caroline. It's been a great journey to go on with you, as it always is. And thank you for coming back and speaking to us again. Thanks for offering the slides as well. I'm sure it'd be great to pass those on, and I'll make sure everyone gets them. I hope it's been beneficial for everybody. It's been it's an intense journey that we are going on, and it will be, and it has to be, as Caroline says. But as Caroline says, we only by going through it can we get to the end and find that acceptance and hopefully empowerment and energy to move forwards.
Well, and you know, we've incarnated into this world at this point in time for some reason, so we may as well be here and make the most of it, right? There's a sweet little story I'm leaving you with. So there's two children walking down a beach one day behind their parents, and there's been a big storm on the beach, and all of these sea creatures have been thrown up on the beach because there's storms. And some of them are alive still, and their children are picking them up and throwing them back in if they're alive, and the children are taking ages over this, right? And the parents are annoyed because they want to get on with the walk, right? You may know this story. And the parents turn around and say, hey, look, you can't save all of these creatures. There's hundreds of them. I want to get on, come on. And the children picked up like one creature each and looked at it and looked at their parents and threw it back in the water and said, well, I made a difference to that one, right? You only have to save one each, right? It makes a difference. That one that you save is meaningful. That's enough, right? If we all saved one, we'd have saved the planet by now. So yeah, just do that stuff. Right, I've got to jump because I've got a teenager waiting for me. Good luck. And thank you guys for what you're doing.
Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.